Did your family walk on eggshells or explode without warning?
I always imagined the night of my promotion would feel like stepping onto a stage where every spotlight was finally aimed at me after years of watching my sister soak up the applause while I stood somewhere in the shadows, holding my achievements close like scraps no one else wanted. The restaurant buzzed with clinking glasses, murmured congratulations from colleagues, and the faint hum of piano keys from a corner player who seemed blissfully unaware that my entire life had been building toward this evening. I had worked late nights that bled into early mornings, taken the projects no one else wanted, stayed silent when others claimed credit, and pushed through the kind of exhaustion that leaves you questioning whether success is worth the sacrifice. And here it was, the moment where my boss had shaken my hand earlier in the day, called me into his office, and given me the news. I was being promoted to senior director, a title that carried not only a higher paycheck but also validation that my work mattered. I should have felt on top of the world, but as my father leaned back in his chair, swirling the last of his bourbon with a smirk plastered across his face, I knew the night was about to take a turn. "You know," he said loudly enough for the table next to us to hear, "your sister's the real success in this family. This promotion of yours is nice, but she's the one who actually made something of herself." The words landed heavier than the steak knife I had been gripping, and though I forced myself to keep my expression neutral, my insides twisted into the familiar knot I had carried since childhood. My colleagues looked down at their plates politely, pretending they hadn't heard the jab, but the heat rising in my chest made me want to scream that this was supposed to be my night. My mother gave a half-hearted laugh, the kind of noise she made whenever my father went too far, but she lacked the energy or courage to stop him. And there I sat, in the center of the table, trying to keep my dignity intact while the man who raised me cut me down in front of the very people I wanted to impress. The truth is, this wasn't new. Every birthday, every graduation, every accomplishment I had managed to squeeze out of my stubborn persistence was always weighed against whatever my sister, Angela, had managed to pull off with less effort and more applause. She was the golden child, the one with the charm, the one with the perfect smile that could sell a lie as easily as a truth. My father never missed a chance to remind me that Angela was the standard I could never quite reach, and even now, with a title I had earned in a company where Angela's name carried no weight, I was being compared to her as if my promotion was nothing more than a participation trophy. I raised my glass slowly, forcing a smile onto my face, and made some polite comment about being grateful for the opportunity, my voice steady though my hands trembled beneath the table. Inside, I felt the old anger simmering, the kind that had driven me to succeed in the first place, because I knew if I let it consume me, I would end up lashing out in a way that might destroy the fragile veneer of success I had worked so hard to build. I wanted my father to see me, really see me, for once in his life, but instead, he leaned forward with a grin and added, "Maybe someday you'll catch up to your sister. But until then, let's not get carried away." The laughter that followed from him, shallow and self-satisfied, was the sound of every dismissal I had endured for decades. Before I could muster a response, before I could decide whether to leave the table or let the anger boil in silence, I noticed a shift in the air. The low chatter of the restaurant seemed to fade as a familiar figure entered the room. My boss, a tall man with a calm presence that rarely demanded attention, but always received it, was making his way toward our table, a folded letter in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but his timing was sharp enough to slice through the humiliation I was drowning in. My colleagues straightened in their chairs, my mother adjusted her napkin nervously, and my father looked mildly annoyed that anyone might interrupt the performance he was staging at my expense. The closer my boss came, the heavier the letter seemed to grow in his hand, as though it carried the weight of a truth no one at the table was prepared to hear. He stopped directly behind my chair, placed a steady hand on my shoulder, and cleared his throat. The entire restaurant seemed to pause, forks suspended midair, glasses hovering before lips, and I felt the air shift as though a storm cloud had gathered indoors. My father leaned back with a smirk, assuming perhaps that my boss had come to heap even more praise on me, but when I glanced up at him, I caught the faintest flicker in his eyes, something restrained, something deliberate. The letter glinted faintly under the warm light of the chandelier as he raised it slightly, his gaze flicking between me, my father, and the rest of the table. My stomach tightened, not from fear of what he might say about me, but from the suspicion that whatever was inside that envelope wasn't about me at all. And as the silence stretched thin across the table, I realized the night was only beginning, and the real storm was yet to break. The first time I understood that admiration in our family had a gatekeeper and a velvet rope. I was 12 and holding a science fair ribbon that smelled like fresh cardstock and glue while Angela twirled in a sequined recital dress that scattered light across the living room walls, and my father, with a gentleness he never wasted on me, lifted her onto the coffee table so she could bow to an audience of relatives who did not ask what I had built or why it worked, and that tiny forgetting lived under my skin like a shard that never dissolved, so that even tonight, sitting in an expensive restaurant under a chandelier that threw warm halos over plates I could finally afford, the same old ache pressed forward the moment my father announced that my sister was the real success, and did it with the lazy certainty of a man who believed he could narrate reality into shape. I could have left, and part of me wanted to collect my coat, sign the check, and step into the night where the city air would cool the heat under my collar, yet the other part that had stayed late to clean up other people's messes and taken the projects no one wanted told me to hold my ground, to sit in the middle of the table like the spine of a book that refuses to crack, and to make sure that when the night turned, as I felt it inevitably would, I would be there to witness it without flinching. Angela arrived the way she always did, brushing off lateness like lint, not quite apologizing because apologies concede gravity, dipping her chin at my colleagues as if they were extras in a performance arranged for her entrance, and settling into the chair my mother had saved as though the cushion had been shaped by a crown. She smelled like expensive perfume and urgency, a blend that travels well on people who never expect to be questioned, and she launched into a breathless montage about client dinners, strategic partnerships, and a probable feature in a lifestyle magazine that would, in her words, position her brand at the intersection of taste and ambition. A sentence that floated above the table like a helium balloon no one dared to pop. My father grinned, the kind of grin that throws a rope around a room and tightens it, and he asked her about her latest expansion while my promotion card, heavy, textured, embossed with a title I had chased for years, sat under my water glass like a coaster, which I noticed because noticing is what you learn to do when you are rarely the headline and often the footnote. I listened, and I breathed, and I reminded myself that dignity is not a mood but a practice. Then, while my sister performed and my father nodded as though he were conducting an orchestra of compliments, I excused myself with a smile so thin it almost wasn't there, found the maitre d' near the bar, and with the same calm tone I use when redirecting a meeting full of louder voices, ordered a celebration cake for the table with an inscription that could be read as generous or cutting depending on the angle of your pride. I asked that it arrive just before dessert, that it be set directly between my father and me, and that the message be written in bold script, to the real success, finally seen. The maitre d' looked at me for a quiet second, as if weighing whether the words would bruise or bless, then nodded with professional neutrality. And I returned to the table where the conversation had shifted to vacation homes and invitation lists that always seemed to forget my address. I lifted my glass and offered a toast that was all careful balance, gratitude for a team that had carried weight without complaint, a nod to the company that had taken a chance on me when steadiness mattered more than spectacle. A gentle acknowledgement that promotions are less about trophies and more about being trusted with hard problems, and I watched my father's mouth flatten, just slightly, because praise that does not center his editorial authority tends to sour in his throat, while Angela dipped her head with a smile that looked like ownership, and then, just as I was beginning to feel the tremor of anger turn into resolve, I felt the air change the way it changes when a storm rolls in without lightning, because my boss, whose silhouette had halted behind my chair at the end of the last episode of this long family play, stepped closer and placed one careful hand on my shoulder with a pressure that said, "We are moving now." He bent, not theatrically but decisively, in the quiet way people do when they have decided that privacy is a kindness, but clarity is a duty, and he spoke a single sentence into the space between my ear and my heartbeat, a sentence so measured I could have laid a ruler against each word, and whatever he said, soft, surgical, undeniable, found Angela's smile and peeled it back just enough for me to glimpse the naked fear underneath, while my father, sensing a narrative slipping from his grip, reached for his glass and missed the stem. The cake arrived then, small and elegant, carried by a server whose face held the loyal blankness of someone trained to deliver joy and grief on command, and when the plate landed between my father and me, when the words curled over the frosting like a verdict spoken in cursive, a hush slid across the table that felt, for a flashing instant, like justice wearing white gloves. My father glanced at the inscription, then at me, and found no apology in my eyes because I had given him years of softness, and he had eaten them without tasting, and my colleagues, who know how office politics brews, sipped their water with the reverence people reserve for complicated victories. It was not a grand revenge, not the sort that lights a match and throws it, but it was precise, and it was mine, a quiet recalibration that announced I would no longer accept seating charts where my worth was exiled to the end of the table. And as the server offered a knife and my father's hand floated uselessly above the handle, my boss straightened, lifted the folded letter so that it caught the chandelier's light, and said, in a tone that turned the entire room toward us, that he had come with a message meant for the whole family. At which point Angela set down her glass with a clink that sounded like a crack spreading under ice, and the breath I took then felt like the last one before the water goes dark. The tension at the table had shifted, a subtle but unmistakable current running through the air that made every movement feel like it carried weight, and as I watched my sister adjust the collar of her designer blouse with a careful flick of her wrist, I realized that the poised confidence she displayed so effortlessly was now cracking under a pressure she had not expected, because there are moments in life when the performance you have perfected for years is suddenly measured against a reality that does not bend to your script, and Angela was about to discover that even the most polished acts can unravel when someone outside your carefully constructed bubble holds the pen. My boss remained at the edge of the table, the folded letter in his hand like a dormant threat, the kind that sits quietly in a drawer for months before the day comes when its contents are read aloud and every carefully managed reputation starts to tremble. He watched my sister with an intensity that suggested he had seen too many facades fall apart to be impressed by charm alone, and I felt the slow, deliberate unfolding of suspense settle around us like a blanket that smothered conversation, but left every ear tuned to the imperceptible shift in Angela's posture. The restaurant itself seemed to contract, as if aware that ordinary noise and ambient chatter could not contain what was about to occur, and the low hum of cutlery against china became a distant murmur, while the eyes of my colleagues darted between Angela, my father, and me, measuring the moment with a mix of curiosity and unspoken anticipation, because there is nothing more compelling than the imminent collapse of someone who has long benefited from unquestioned privilege, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that the carefully constructed image my family had cultivated for my sister was beginning to falter at the edges where honesty refuses to be ignored. My father, still smirking though his hand had unconsciously tightened around his glass, had not yet realized that the narrative he had so thoroughly controlled for decades was teetering on the precipice of revelation. And every word he had spoken this evening in praise of Angela now hovered in the air like confetti that would soon lose its celebratory purpose and fall in the face of undeniable truth. As the conversation stuttered, my sister's laugh, once light and triumphant, began to falter, the edges of her carefully maintained composure showing signs of stress that she could not entirely hide, and my mother, ever the observer, shifted in her seat with a nervous energy that suggested she was beginning to grasp the implications of the letter my boss held, but had not yet revealed, because some truths are too heavy to announce without ceremony, and she, like the rest of us, sensed that the moment approaching was one that would alter the dynamics of this family in ways no one could immediately control. The server, aware perhaps of the gathering tension, moved with exaggerated care, setting plates and silverware with a precision that mirrored the delicate timing of events about to unfold, and I watched the subtle interplay of glances, the flick of an eye, the tightening of a jaw, all of which combined into a tapestry of anticipation that made the seconds stretch into minutes that weighed on everyone present with quiet inevitability. I remembered the whispers I had overheard at work weeks before, casual remarks about Angela's shortcuts, small inconsistencies that hinted at ethical lapses, stories that could have been dismissed as rumor if I had not known the source was credible. Because credibility in matters of workplace integrity is as fragile as trust in a family that has always favored appearances over substance, and now, sitting here in the presence of both my father and my boss, I realized that those whispers were about to manifest in a way that no amount of charm, grooming, or social finesse could contain. My mind raced through the years of careful patience, the promotions earned through diligence, and the long nights of proving myself, while my sister had often taken credit for accomplishments that were shared or, in some cases, not hers at all, and I felt a quiet, almost ironic sense of justice preparing to unfold, because the truth, when finally presented, has a way of rearranging the room without violence. Or shouting, simply by existing. The first note of tension that broke the carefully maintained illusion came when my boss cleared his throat, a simple sound that drew every gaze to him and rendered conversation impossible, because authority and timing are inseparable in moments of revelation. And as he raised the folded letter, angling it so that the light caught the seal, I noticed Angela's fingers tightening around the stem of her glass, the subtle tremor betraying the first real sign of fear she had shown in years, and my father's eyes flickered toward her with a confusion that suggested he had not yet fully processed the possibility that his golden child might be flawed in ways that mattered, while I, seated between them, felt the weight of patience and persistence coalesce into a moment of quiet triumph that needed no words, because the story of years of effort and recognition, long deferred, was about to be acknowledged without dispute. Every breath in the restaurant seemed to synchronize with the tension emanating from the table, as if the world itself paused to witness the unraveling, and in that pause, I recognized that revenge need not be loud to be devastating. That patience can sculpt outcomes more sharply than anger, and that the years of being dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated had positioned me at the center of a moment where the truth could finally speak louder than favoritism or charm, leaving all who had doubted me to grapple with the reality that reality itself does not bend to ego, only to consequence. The moment my boss finally unfolded the letter, the room seemed to contract around us, folding every whispered expectation, every carefully curated facade, into a single axis of consequence that neither my sister nor my father could ignore. And the paper itself, crisp and official, felt heavier than any award or promotion I had ever received, because it carried the weight of truth that could not be argued with, a truth that would rearrange the hierarchy my family had relied on for decades and expose the fragile underpinnings of a life built on appearances rather than merit, and I watched as Angela's eyes widened, the carefully constructed mask of confidence slipping to reveal the tension that had been accumulating in her chest for weeks, but which she had so far managed to conceal under rehearsed smiles and polished words. My father, who had spent a lifetime dictating who could be praised and who should be dismissed, froze in a moment of incomprehension, his hand hovering uselessly over the table as though he could physically intercept the reality that was being laid bare before him, and in that frozen tableau, I felt the culmination of every slight, every ignored achievement, every instance where my dedication had been minimized, coalesce into a quiet satisfaction that required no triumphalism, because the truth itself was sufficient to recalibrate the scales that had long been unbalanced. The words on the letter were simple, factual, and damning. My sister, Angela, had been terminated from her position at the company she had boasted about for months, dismissed for a series of serious violations that compromised her integrity and jeopardized client trust, and as my boss read the content aloud with precise enunciation, each syllable landing like a hammer striking a bell of inevitability, the murmurs of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the intensity of that revelation to dominate the atmosphere, and I realized that the room was no longer just a dining space, but a stage on which years of favoritism, arrogance, and unearned superiority were being dismantled in real time, leaving those who had assumed unshakable positions scrambling to reconcile the disparity between perception and reality. My sister's hands trembled against the glass she had been gripping, and the polished mask of composure she had perfected over the years began to crumble as she looked from my father to me, realizing that the safety net she had always counted on was gone. Because the letter represented not only professional consequences, but also a rupture in the carefully managed narrative that had allowed her to exist as the golden child while my accomplishments were repeatedly downplayed, and in that instant, I understood the magnitude of what patience, diligence, and integrity could yield when measured against a life constructed solely on charm and selective effort. My father's face, which had rarely displayed uncertainty, lost its usual flush of control, shifting to a pallor that indicated both shock and a dawning awareness that his assessments and public pronouncements had been spectacularly misaligned with the facts, and every congratulatory remark he had issued regarding Angela's so-called successes now hovered in the air like empty currency, valueless in the presence of undeniable evidence. As the letter concluded, silence enveloped the table, punctuated only by the quiet shuffle of silverware and the subtle intake of breaths from those around us who were now spectators to a familial reckoning that had been years in the making. And in that silence, I felt a sense of equilibrium that had been denied to me for decades, a quiet satisfaction that came not from gloating or vindictiveness, but from witnessing the long-overdue acknowledgement that merit, integrity, and sustained effort can prevail even when obscured by favoritism or ignorance. My boss, who had orchestrated the timing with precision, placed the letter on the table with a deliberate weight that invited reflection, and the collective gaze of everyone present shifted, as though the universe itself had paused to allow the implications to settle. Angela, exposed and vulnerable. My father, stripped of the certainty he had long wielded as authority. And me, finally recognized not just for a single promotion, but for a lifetime of persistence, competence, and resilience. The conversation that followed was tentative, awkward, and filled with halting attempts at justification from my father, who struggled to reclaim a sense of authority in a moment that no longer answered to his judgment alone, while my mother hovered uneasily, seeking to mediate a balance that had already been irreversibly altered, and Angela, confronted with the reality of her own failures and the fragility of her previously unassailable status, retreated into a silence that was as revealing as any confession, because it was in that quiet withdrawal that the weight of accountability first fully registered, forcing her to confront the consequences of choices long obscured by privilege and appearances. I felt no need to speak, no urge to comment or to deliver a cutting remark, because the moment itself, carefully orchestrated by truth and patience, contained every measure of satisfaction I could have desired, leaving the family to reckon with its own assumptions while I observed with a calm awareness that, for once, recognition had arrived unmediated, undeniable, and permanent. The aftermath of the revelation settled over the table like a dense, almost tangible fog, forcing every person present to navigate the silence and the weight of truths that had been suppressed for decades. And as I watched my sister push her chair back with a stiffness that betrayed both shock and indignation, the careful composure she had cultivated over years of unearned privilege crumbling beneath the undeniable consequence of her actions, I realized that this was a moment that would be remembered not for the promotion I had earned, but for the clarity it brought to a family that had long operated under assumptions of favoritism and selective recognition. Because the equilibrium of acknowledgement had shifted irrevocably, and the scale of merit, which had once been ignored in favor of charm and circumstance, now commanded the attention of every observer, leaving no room for misinterpretation or denial. My father, whose face had paled when the letter was revealed, now sat frozen with a combination of disbelief and reluctant awareness, his hand hovering near his glass, unmoving, as if the simple act of raising it would somehow summon the narrative back into alignment with the illusions he had long preferred. And my mother, ever the mediator, struggled to find words that could simultaneously console, justify, and redirect, but even her measured tones faltered in the face of an outcome that no amount of persuasion could mitigate. Angela's retreat from the table was deliberate, her movements sharp and controlled, but every step carried the subtle tremor of someone grappling with the sudden loss of the pedestal upon which she had balanced her identity. And I observed her with a clarity born of years of being overshadowed, noting the shift in posture, the tightening of her jaw, and the fleeting glances toward my father that sought reassurance in a hierarchy that had dissolved in an instant, because for her, the world had always been a stage where she could dictate perception, and the revelation of her termination had stripped away not just her professional status, but the carefully curated image that had allowed her to exist without facing scrutiny, accountability, or consequence. My father, confronted with the tangible result of his preferential blindness, sat in a state of quiet reflection, the habitual certainty that had defined his judgments and assessments now fractured, and every instinct he had relied upon to assert authority was rendered ineffective in a room where truth, patience, and diligence had finally supplanted narrative and favoritism. As the initial shock began to settle, conversation tentatively resumed, filtered through the lens of new awareness, and I felt the subtle relief of no longer needing to prove myself to an audience that had systematically discounted my achievements. Because the events of the evening had created a space in which recognition was no longer conditional upon charm, proximity, or favoritism, but instead rested solely on the undeniable foundation of merit and consistent effort, and in that space, I found a quiet satisfaction that required no expression beyond the measured calm in my posture and the deliberate patience in my breathing, because the vindication was complete in its silent assertion rather than any overt display. My colleagues, whose presence had been a secondary reassurance, now shared the subtle acknowledgement that my success was long overdue and entirely deserved, and their polite, restrained congratulations carried a weight that my father and mother could not influence or manipulate, serving as a reminder that external validation, grounded in competence and integrity, is often more durable and meaningful than familial approval. When the evening drew toward its close and the waiter cleared the last remnants of dessert while the remaining patrons of the restaurant returned to the normal cadence of conversation and clatter, I rose from the table with deliberate composure, collecting my coat and handbag while noting the tentative gestures from my mother and the avoidance in my father's gaze, and as I stepped into the crisp night air, the weight of expectation, judgment, and dismissal that had shadowed my life began to lift, replaced with the clear, unambiguous understanding that recognition of my worth had arrived not through argument, confrontation, or ostentation, but through the patient accumulation of evidence, persistence, and unwavering commitment to integrity. And as I walked down the sidewalk beneath the glow of street lamps that cast long, steady shadows, I felt the rare freedom that comes when one's accomplishments are acknowledged without interference, manipulation, or misinterpretation. The city breathed around me, alive and indifferent, yet in that indifference I found resonance with the life I had built, the career I had fought for, and the quiet knowledge that while family dynamics and favoritism are enduring, the consequences of truth, diligence, and patience have a way of asserting themselves in moments that cannot be ignored, leaving every participant, from my sister to my father, to reconcile with the inevitability that the measures of achievement and merit are not determined by proximity or preference, but by consistent effort, ethical action, and the courage to persist even when recognition seems perpetually withheld. And as I vanished into the night, the last thought I carried was the certainty that satisfaction and validation need not be claimed through vengeance or confrontation, because when truth is patient, its arrival is absolute and indisputable.